All right, we are recording. Hi there, I'm Valerie Stivers, and this is Hank Zona.
Hi, everybody.
Um, I am a food writer. I write a column for a literary journal called the Paris Review, where I create recipes based on food scenes in famous classic literature. And Hank is a wine expert and does events. A wine expert, educator, and does events. And we are re-drinking, which means we are bringing you a current and exciting take on a beverage or wine or spirit with a interesting cultural history. Today, that is wine from New Mexico, which we are drinking chilled red wine, and I came to this through the work of D.H. Lawrence. And my first question was, is there wine from New Mexico? Because that would not have struck me as usual. So I asked Hank, my spirits collaborator, is there wine from New Mexico? Tell us.
And I said, of course there is. There's plenty of wine in New Mexico, and we're going to get into the history of it. But even now, currently, there's 50 wineries in New Mexico, and one of the best domestic sparkling wine producers, Gruet, is housed in Mexico, and then New Mexico, and they are a French champagne family that searched throughout the United States to find a place to make their wine, and they settled in on New Mexico as the best place to do it. So, but we're not going to taste their wine. We're going to go back more historically in a bit.
Yes. Okay. So D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence was an Englishman, and he's best known for the book Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is probably the world's most famous banned book. He wrote it in the 1920s, and it did not get published until the late 1950s, and in some ways remains controversial even to this day, although not for the same reasons, because when it was originally published, he was one of the first people to describe sex in any detail, to refer to a penis as being erect, even in a slightly not literal way. He was the first person to use the word fuck in a work of mainstream literature, and at the time that was a very big deal. So he spent actually a lot of his career outside of England because he would be in trouble for obscenity law, and his work was being suppressed. He wasn't making any money, and he had to live cheaply, often abroad, and on the run. So he lived in Italy, and he also lived in New Mexico, which is what I ended up focusing on. But Hank has been reading his book of Italian. He did travel writing. Oh, pretty. He did travel writing to pay the bills, and he wrote this book on Italy. So what is a D.H. Lawrence travel log like? Tell us.
It's like a D.H. Lawrence novel.
Oh, no.
In my experience with D.H. Lawrence, my first experience was 20th century novels my senior year in high school, my all boys Catholic high school, and the shock of bringing Sons and Lovers home, and my parents wondering why we were reading that in a Catholic high school. But what's interesting about that book, and what's in Lady Chatterley's Lover, and what's in the travel book so far that I've read, is that the association is that his books are about sex, but they really are a lot about character analysis, and it also about that tug between the tug of urbanization and industrialization versus formerly agrarian economies, and he touches upon that a lot in this book written 100 years ago, this travel log.
Right. Yes. No. It's actually he was famous for being about sex, but what he really did. Oh, and here's D.H. Lawrence, by the way. There he is. So he's famous for writing about sex, but one of the reasons that he was writing about sex is because he had an alternative spirituality and an alternative way of understanding the world, which was placing a pair of lovers, a man and a woman in his reckoning of it, basically at the center of your moral universe, and that active and actually overtly sexual relationship was the metaphor for how you would relate to your greater environment. So you were both in relationship with other people and then in relationship to the world around you. Which makes him a really interesting person to cook from and to drink from, because both food and wine are, again, very much about our bodies and our relationship to the world around us. So, cooking from D.H. Lawrence was an interesting thing to do. So can you tell us a little bit about the wine that you recommended for my D.H. Lawrence menu?
Well, one of the coolest things that I think that you did for this, for your D.H. Lawrence menu, was you built a bread oven. out
Yes.
of brick and cinder blocks. You can get all kinds of things at Home Depot, and sometimes they actually work. And yours worked when you created this oven. But you came up with a menu, and I said, so a little bit of history. New Mexico is the part of what is now the United States where grapes were first grown to make wine, long before there was a New Mexico. And this was 400 plus years ago. And it was Spanish missionaries that brought the mission grape, or Listan Negra, I believe it's called, from Spain. They actually smuggled it in because Spanish government didn't want anybody growing their own grapes to make wine. They wanted to be able to sell it from Spain and tax it as well. But the missionaries smuggled it in, and it became known as the mission grape. And the mission grape has been grown for over 400 years throughout the southwestern United States, up into California, down all the way into South America. So I thought it might be fun to take a look at a historical grape that has had a renaissance lately. And that is the grape that is known as Pais in
Right
South
here.
America, from Chile, or known as the mission grape here still in the United States. It was really a junk grape wine, if you will, for a lot of years. It was what the people drank as cheap table wines that they drank in the fields. But like a lot of things, what is old is new and hot again. And there's some real craft production now happening with Pais in Chile and Listan Negro in Mexico, and some producers now have resurrected 80-year-old mission grapevines in California too.
Right. So this is what's so cool is that D.H. Lawrence was living there in the 1920s, and there were vineyards there at that time, and they could have easily been making this grape.
Yep.
And then I suppose you said that there was less production of wine in New Mexico. There was a flood or something that stopped the.
So from like the mid 1800s right up until middle of World War II, New Mexico was one of the top wine producing regions in the United States, amazingly, especially from the late 1800s up through the 20s when he was there. D.H. Lawrence was in New Mexico during Prohibition, but you said that there's commentary about them drinking, which a lot of people
moonshine,
did.
only once.
Drinking moonshine, right. They mentioned moonshine, but people drank during Prohibition. Wine was made for medicinal and for sacramental purposes. So this mission grape would have certainly still been going really strong at that point. New Mexico and really the two things that really hurt their industry the most and kind of knocked it back until it was resurrected about 20 so years ago was Prohibition, which hurt winemaking in many parts of this country, even though wine was still able to be made for personal use and for sacramental purposes. But also then in the early 40s, there was the San Antonio flooded tremendously, and it really kind of finally wiped out the wine industry as it was known then in New Mexico. And again, it took probably another 50 years for it to kind of come back.
Right. And what I thought was so neat about it was that, we haven't, New Mexican wine is not well known right now, but Chilean wine is, and this is actually a very common grape that you would have in a Chilean wine. So,
even this grape, though, interesting enough, Valerie, is kind of had a resurrection there too. It's a grape that was used for local consumption, for blending. Again, in Chile, where we get a lot of our produce in the winter because of their excellent growing conditions, they would grow mass-produced grapes too and make the types of wines that they felt the American market and other major markets would want. But then there are some producers like Derek Mossman and his wife Pilar Miranda, who founded Garage Wine Company. That the bottle that you showed, that I've got a bottle of too. There we go.
Showing it right in there.
So it's interesting that you see on that label 215 BC. BC stands for before Cabernet. That means that these vines were planted 215 years before Cabernet was first planted in Chile. And Cabernet was planted in Chile probably well over 125, 150 years ago. So these vines in their existence in southern United States through Latin America into South America has been around for 400 years. It's just kind of pretty fascinating.
And another fascinating thing about this wine that you chose is that it was amazing with my meal. And completely
No, that's
delicious.
what I do.
I did. I had it chilled, but
Mhm.
the food that I made, going back to D.H. Lawrence and his values, and to food that was mentioned in his books, is he tended to treat food in two different ways. Often as an example of the ridiculousness of urban elites. So he would have some people are drinking absinthe and eating oysters, and you can tell he disapproves. And then his good characters, like the gameskeeper in Lady Chatterley's Lover, will be eating something simple, like a simple chop or bread with cheese and chives. So I sort of following on the DIY ethos that D.H. Lawrence lived when he lived in outside of Taos.
Mhm.
I built a bread oven and made bread to put cheese and chives on, and I also served a simple chop with a stewed mushroom crust, which was not actually that simple, but I have a hard time making simple pork chop be tender, and putting a crust on it is a nice way to make it tender. And I cook that in the outdoor oven too. And when my column on the Paris
Wow.
Food runs, we can see more of that food and discuss it. But the amazing thing about the wine was how just fresh it was and how well it went with my pork. And especially I had sage in the mushrooms, and tasting that wine immediately, the taste of the sage really came out. And can you tell us any more about that, the taste of the wine,
Well,
and why it was such a good match?
yes, and part of it goes really speaks to the winemaking process too. So Mossman and his wife and a business partner only make about 1,500 cases of wine a year. Uh, some of the biggest Chilean producers are producing in the millions of cases a year. So you can argue that these big producers may spill more in a year than Garage Wine Company actually produces. So what he wanted to do is take these old vines, forgotten vines, in some kind of out of the way areas, make wine as naturally as possible, low intervention as possible. A lot of them are aged in open vats. They use, in many cases, recycled bottles for their wines.
Mm-hmm.
There's no intervention, no additives or anything go into it. The wines are certainly organic and probably biodynamic. But what's interesting about these wines is that because of that, there is a freshness to them,
Uh-huh.
and you do get a purity of the fruit coming through, but it's not really candied fruit. So it's not a
Uh-huh.
wine that would come. It's a wine that tastes fruity, but also wouldn't be considered sweet or jammy or ripe tasting.
Mhm.
And the oak influence is really the fact that it's neutral oak, usually these old vats that they use. But there's also a savory nature that comes through, and I think you really picked that up with your food. It was that this savory, herby sort of taste that was in that wine really kind of struck a note with the food.
It did. And you know what's so interesting, which I find, is that while you are a wine expert, I am not. I am a home cook and a reader. And it's so interesting to me how when you taste something and you just say what you think, like I said, it tasted fresh. There's a reason for it. It actually is fresh, and it
Yeah,
has to do with the making of the wine. And
yeah.
sort of spontaneously, you can trust your taste buds a lot more than people sometimes think they can. But let's talk about
That's an
chilled.
excellent point, by the way. That's an excellent point. People need to trust their palates, need to trust their taste buds, and especially when it comes now to analyzing what we eat and what we drink. I think people should really take time to consider what they're eating. Go for really good quality stuff that is well made, but also to enjoy it. That's the main purpose of it. So
And without it being high pressure also. I mean, to take
right.
time to consider is, that thing that just struck you, you're probably right. Like there isn't necessarily, I mean, there are wrong answers, I suppose, but not many. But let's tell people a little bit more about drinking this red wine cold, because I thought that was another incredibly sexy and interesting thing for summer was, you know, you can put just any bottle of red cold in the fridge. How do you decide what should be cold? And it certainly worked for my wine, but tell us more about that.
Well, Pais, which is the grape that we're talking about here, Pais, Mission, whatever folks want to call it, is a grape that really lends itself well to drinking at room temperature or drinking chilled. One of the first things though to backtrack and mention here is that in our country we drink our white wines too cold, and we drink our red wines too warm. So room
What about our
temperature.
rosés? We drink them all day just right?
We drink them probably too cold too, but some of them are probably best drunk cold. But we're not going to get into that right now. But red wine shouldn't be at like room temperature. Red wine should have a slight chill to it. Red wine should be maybe winter room temperature. Like you're not cranking the heat all day. Maybe a 60, 65 degrees, not 70, 75 degrees. Tepid wine does not taste good. Also, when wine is warm, uh, you're not picking up some certain flavors in it. It's always going to taste kind of flat. You're going to miss out, I think, on a lot of the acidity of it. And conversely, if it's too cold, you're killing your taste buds. You're deadening them from the cold, and you're not picking up a lot of the nuance. You might not pick up the that herbaceousness in that wine if it was too cold. If you had it like super chilled, and then you sort of miss out on what's kind of fun to see how it interplays then with what you're eating. Now, some red wines aren't going to work chilled. Big oaky red wines, high alcohol red wines are not. They're going to taste bitter, stringent, and really what's going to come through is the oak, and it's going to really the tannins are going to come through too. That chalky taste you get with tea that you also have in a lot of big red wines, and that's not pleasing at all. So you want lower alcohol, lighter red wine.
Later flavors.
Yeah, lighter flavors, lower alcohol, little to no oak whatsoever. Because again, what's going to end up happening is think of oak here as makeup. And if there's heavy makeup on, it's going to actually really mask what's underneath. And there's tasteful applications of makeup, and there's too heavy application. But you're not going to taste it.
And food. Back to food. What kind of summer menu would be good? I know, off of makeup and back to food. What kind of summer menu would be good to serve a chilled red with?
I think a lot of the food that you would have in other seasons with a non-chilled red wine would work. Especially we barbecue. Everyone grills and barbecues. So grilled meats, barbecued meats. You also have to consider not just the protein here or the main part of the dish, but also the other components in it, and consider the whole dish really. So you're not likely to be having a big grilled steak with a big baked potato or a big pile of mashed potatoes, but more likely salad or like a tomato salad or corn or something lighter. So consider that the whole dish right off the bat is going to be lighter. The wine should be lighter too. And so even for example, there are some beef dishes that I would drink, especially if you're using say Asian spices or something with like a fruit marinade. I'm happy drinking a rosé or even a sturdy white wine with that in summer, depending on what the dish is. So I would say what you're having for summer is generally going to work pretty well with a chilled red wine.
Well, D.H. Lawrence was not particularly a foodie. I mean, he lived a very austere life, and I don't know how any of this menu would have gone over for him, but for me, he was enormously fun to read and enormously interesting. He's a writer who is controversial for some real reasons today. But sort of finding what you can find in him and finding the interesting ways that his work connects to the modern era is worth redrinking. So cheers. Thank you very much. And
I was not going to open a wine, by the way, but I decided to open one Pais, and you can just see that nice light color in there, can't you?
That is absolutely beautiful.
It's really pretty, and it smells really good. And
yum. All right. We have been redrinking. We hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.